close your eyes. When I say Jesus, what picture comes to your mind? Now, open your eyes. Does he look something like this? As a Christian and an African American, I've been asked many times why I associate myself with the white man's religion. But my response is that religion doesn't have a race. There is no form that requires you to fill in the bubble for your ethnicity before you can become a Christian. So why is it that so many people see color when they think of God? The answer is the devastating lack of representation in the visuals generated by the church. Christianity is incorrectly perceived the white man's religion because unconscious bias leads to a disparity between perceived reality and verbal messages. Now, you may be thinking, I'm not Christian, why should this speech matter to me? But the truth is, lack of representation is everywhere, not just within the church. Ironically, unconscious bias does not discriminate. It affects our schools, our communities, our workplaces, and our places of worship. If you are working to create an inclusive atmosphere in any area of life, then my speech applies to you. So let's get started. If you were to look up Adam and Eve or Jesus on Google Images, the majority of the photos would look like this. These characters have been depicted as white Europeans for hundreds of years. But is there anything in the foundations of the Christian faith to justify this? To investigate, I went to the Bible. The very first book is Genesis, which is where the story of Adam and Eve takes place. Genesis 2:10-14 states that a river went out from Eden to water the garden. From there, it divided and became the source of 4 rivers. The third river is the Tigris, which runs east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were in a location called Mesopotamia. Theologians believe that it is based on this evidence that the Garden of Eden was in Iraq, in the Middle East. If we look at Jesus' birthplace, we see a similar pattern. The book of Luke writes that Joseph went with his wife Mary into the city of David, the town of Bethlehem, in order to be registered along with all of his people. While they were there, Mary gave birth to a son, and his name was Jesus. Bethlehem borders the Gaza Strip on the left side, which is in Egypt, which is in Africa. Biblical evidence shows that these major stories which make up the Christian faith actually take place in Northeast Africa and Western Asia, not in Europe. So if not from the Bible, then where does this misconception come from that Christianity is primarily the white man's religion? This incorrect perception is caused by an overwhelming lack of diversity in the Christian mission field. In order to reach those who may be hearing their message for the first time, missionaries intentionally go to countries where people know little about their religion. Therefore, they are perceived as a sample group for Christians everywhere. And if the only missionaries one sees are white, it is perfectly logical to assume that all missionaries are white and that it is therefore primarily the white man's religion. Let's look at some examples. These are 3 teams from local churches who went to Kenya, Nicaragua, and Haiti this past year. Let's take a closer look. This is my mission team. We were only in Haiti for 8 days, but I found myself wishing that I could stay forever. I fell in love with the bright-colored buildings, the vendors riding donkeys on their way to the market, the joy of calling to strangers in the street, "Bonsoir, good afternoon," the red dirt that I could taste between my teeth and feel between my toes after playing games with little kids in the dirt, and the call of roosters, waking me up at 4 o'clock in the morning so I could watch the sunrise over the mountains. Haiti is a beautiful country, and we were there not just to admire the scenery, but to tell people about Jesus. In order to do this, we used a wordless picture book to overcome the language barrier between us and the Haitians. This is the very same book that we used, and on every page, Jesus is depicted as white. I noticed this while we were training for our trip, but I didn't want to bring any attention to race, because out of the 22 students and leaders on my team, I was the only one who wasn't white. Therefore, I convinced myself that maybe I was just overreacting, and the color of our cartoon biblical characters wasn't really that important. But I soon saw the danger of this lack of visual representation. We shared this white book with a black man on the side of a dirt road. He listened intently to what we were saying, and when we finished, he said, I understand your story, but why is Jesus white? And we said, he's not white. Jesus has no race. And he said, then why have you drawn him as white? And there was nothing we could say. Ultimately, he rejected Christianity because he didn't see himself represented in our story. And this was not the only way that we witnessed the lack of visual representation and the power that it has. While we were in Haiti, my team visited an organization set up by missionaries from Minnesota that provides education for Haitian youth. The leader of the school introduced us to some of her students before informing us that most of them would have to quit school in the following year so that they could get jobs to provide for their families. A common saying here, she said, is that the Haitian dreams for the blanc. These kids have grown dependent on white missionaries to survive. Her words broke my heart. For as long as I can remember, I have been surrounded by successful Black lawyers, missionaries, entrepreneurs, and corporate leaders. Their presence alone showed me that I was capable of creating a future for myself. This vital catalyst for success, believing that you can be successful, was taken from the Haitian kids and the fact that they saw primarily white missionaries. After an earthquake struck Haiti in 2010, a USA Today article noted that over 10,000 non-government organizations flooded the nation in order to help, including churches, volunteer teams, and charities that consisted mostly of white affluent Americans. While the work that they were doing was incredibly helpful, their overall presence showed the Haitian children that they would never be able to provide for themselves and that they would always be the ones in need. There was no one to show them that they could one day be successful and support themselves. Regardless of your religious viewpoint, please hear me when I say that what people see when they look at you will always speak louder than your words. While unconscious bias is a very complex and difficult issue to solve, we can begin to tackle this particular facet concerning the lack of visual representation in 3 steps. First, do your research. It is impossible for one person to truly and accurately depict multiple and diverse perspectives with only their own experiences to draw from. We have to educate ourselves on the ideas we wish to portray in our visuals before we make them. Any good English teacher will tell you that you need more than one valid source to write a good essay. The same principle applies. In the case of Christianity, we have already examined that there is no evidence in the Bible for all of its characters to be portrayed as white. This information is easily accessible. Christians simply need to choose to actively educate themselves on the images that they wish to portray rather than using their own experiences as the only source for their visual representation. Second, check your work. Because unconscious bias is by nature unconscious, there is no way for any of us to actively and accurately identify our own personal prejudices. We need the outside opinions and sober judgment of other people with different perspectives to evaluate our images. To revisit my experience in Haiti, the unconscious bias of our wordless book prevented us from truly and passionately advancing the message that we were trying to portray in our visuals. Had we actively pursued outside opinions while we were still creating our visuals, our unconscious bias could have been identified, and so many conflicts would have been avoided. Finally, be intentional. In order to truly root out unconscious bias, we have to be intentional in creating a space where people feel safe enough to voice their opinions without fear of consequence. Let me give you an example. I've been running on the Edina Girls track team for 2 years now. It is by far one of the most inclusive and rewarding activities I participated in so far at the high school. Through personalized notes on our lockers before meets and encouraging speeches, our coaches inspire us to run after our goals and do our best. In addition to this, the captains and leaders all work hard to create an environment where people feel safe enough to make new friends and meet new people. There's a lot of intention that goes into making the track team an inclusive environment. This year, our coaches wanted to try something new to further uplift our team. They created a mascot, Edna. She was similar to an American Girl doll. When our coach first introduced her to us, she held her out in front of the group and said, "This doll represents every single runner, jumper, and thrower on our team." We have girls of all different sizes and body types and races on our team. One look at these pictures would tell you that visually, Edna does not represent every single athlete on our team. The idea of a team mascot still worked really well. But after talking with some of the other athletes, I found that I wasn't the only one who noticed that Edna didn't visually represent us as a whole. Fortunately, my coaches conduct an anonymous survey at the end of each season to discuss things that went well and things that didn't without any fear of consequence. This allows me the freedom to address issues like a lack of visual representation or unconscious bias without worrying about whether or not I will lose my spot next year. Something as simple as this can serve as a solution to lack of representation. Therefore, this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, that not enough people are talking about. And although it can be daunting to address the lack of visual representation, it is vital that we do confront it. Had I found the courage to talk to my mission team about my apprehension concerning our Word This Book while we were still in training, again, a lot of conflicts could have been avoided. Therefore, the question is not, should we address unconscious bias, but rather, how do we address it? It requires respect from both parties. You cannot point out an issue like a lack of visual representation with the intent of just shaming someone else and making a scene. Rather, you have to want to move forward and actively look for a solution. Alternatively, when people approach you in a respectful attempt to address a lack of visual representation, don't get defensive and don't get offended. Instead, when they feel safe enough to come to you, recognize the opportunity for growth. In conclusion, lack of visual representation causes damage in communities across the globe. It creates a divide between those who see themselves and those who don't, but it doesn't have to. Unconscious bias may feel like too big of a fight for us to take on, but you have so much power at your fingertips. The next time you make a PowerPoint presentation or a video or a sign or a poster, you have a choice to make. It could be as simple as choosing a different stock photo, because our visuals really do carry that much weight. Will you join me in raising awareness by correcting the lack of representation in our visuals? Or will you close your eyes and refuse to see what's right in front of you? Thank you.
People who made up the Israelite communities, both in the Old and New Testament, were people of color, namely black people. We know that the world's first man, that the father of modern humans, was a black man in East Africa. DNA evidence bears that out. In fact, the National Geographic Society, along with IBM, came together and they put together the Genographic Project. It was headed by Dr. Spencer Wells, and it concluded in 2005. It was a 10-year study, and they went worldwide, Dr. Spencer Wells and his team, collecting DNA evidence from indigenous communities worldwide. And they wanted to find who is the father of modern humans. And so we know women have two X chromosomes and men have an X and a Y chromosome. So they studied the Y chromosome and they traced it back 60,000 years to East Africa. And Dr. Wells and his team concluded that the first modern human was a black man in East Africa, whom the Bible identifies as Adam. So we know that through DNA evidence. And then the descendants of Adam, obviously, would have been black people.
Right, right. Tell me what made you interested in this subject.
What made me interested, Stephen, is that in the black church, we were having a defection of African-American young people, millennials. And I was trying to figure out why were they defecting from the church, right? And where are they going and why are they leaving, you know. It wasn't like my generation. I'm a baby boomer. You know, we came to church and we didn't ask many questions or anything. Yeah.
You just did it because you were supposed to.
We did it because we were supposed to, you know. But this generation of millennials are now asking questions. You know, they're questioning the efficacy of the church. They're questioning the authenticity of the scripture. They're questioning the historicity of Jesus. And the church has not answered those questions adequately enough. And so this was a study. It started off as a study, particularly for my millennials at our church. And it turned into a 9-month study, and then that study turned into a book. So it was as if the millennial generation pushed me into writing this book.
Yeah. What lessons, other than sort of the obvious connection to modern African and African American people, what lessons do you feel we should draw from this evidence, this proof that black people were among these early tribes of humans?
Well, it's empowering, because it contradicts the traditional notion that the people of the Bible, from Adam all the way to Jesus, were people of European descent. And that's just not true. That's just not factual. And so it's empowering to a community to look in the biblical text and see themselves as a part of salvation history, not sitting on the sideline waiting for someone else to win salvation for us,
Yes.
but that people of African descent were actually the authors of salvation history, which draws the African American reader into the story because part of me is in the story. That's empowering. And people raise a question to me, as I lecture around the country on this topic, particularly when it comes to the racial makeup of Jesus Christ. People ask, what difference does it make? I mean, he died for our sins. He's the Savior of the world. And the answer is that that's the wrong question. What difference does his color make? That's the wrong question. The question is, since we know that Jesus Christ was not a Scandinavian, because he's depicted as Scandinavian, he's depicted as a European in the traditional images of Jesus, and we know that he didn't look like that. The question is not what difference does his color make. The question is, why have he been whitewashed?
Why have we done that? Why have we allowed that?
That's the question that we should be pursuing.
Yeah. In the neighborhood where I was born, here in Detroit, there's a Catholic church called St. Cecilia, which in the 1960s, like many Catholic churches in the city, was starting to change in its population as the city was changing, and it was becoming more African American. And the priest there told an African American artist who was a member of the congregation, to paint a mural behind the altar. And he said, I want you to try to reflect what you think, why you feel connected to this religion and to this church. And this artist painted a 35 foot image of Jesus as a black man. And the controversy that ensued is legend, not just in the neighborhood, but all over the country. I mean, the Washington Post came and wrote a story about it. But that reaction when someone suggested in the late 1960s, hey, this is who I see when I think about Christ, I see an African American. It elicited this very visceral response, right? People are very protective of these other images. And I think that speaks, again, to the importance of making sure the truth is understood. I think it's one thing to say everyone should be able to see themselves in the church and in Christ, but then there's also the necessity to have fact rule our discussion of those things.
Jesus was a human being, a historical figure, and he bore the indigenous physical characteristics of his community.
Of the other people from that area, right?
He is a historical reality. And so to negate his color, to negate his racial composition, is to negate part of who he is, because his race, the way he looked, is a part of his ontological being. It's a part of him. So you can't separate Christ from his ethnicity, from his color, and say you are accepting Christ as your Lord and Savior. You either accept all of him or you don't accept him at all. And we don't have the luxury to say that I am going to conform Christ into a color that's comfortable for me.
Right. Right.
You can't do that.
Yeah.
You know.
All right. Well, congratulations on the work, and thanks very much for being
Alrighty.
here.
Thank you, man.
Good to
Appreciate
have you home
it.
in Detroit.
Alrighty.
Right?
All right. God bless you.
The first icons were painted in the 6th century. That's 500 years after Jesus died. So how could the artists have known the color of his hair or the shape of his face?
Josias has found that the face in the icons corresponds to a type of skull not found in Israel. The face of Jesus would have been closer to these Jewish skulls. They were found in Jerusalem and they date to the 1st century.
And if you look at this, notice how this is very long and this is very, very narrow. It's a complete different type.
We used the 1st century skull to get even closer to the face of the Jesus of history.
This certainly doesn't look anything like the images that one associates with him, and I think it's much more likely to be an accurate reflection of the majority of people who would have been around at that time.
Look at these telling images from a Jewish synagogue in Syria. They were painted in the 3rd century, less than 200 years from the time of Jesus. They're the earliest pictures of Jewish people in the world, and fashions back then changed slowly.
The kind of hairstyle that you get, it's short, it's curly, it's, if you like, afro in style, and this seems to be almost uniform in the way that Jesus is depicted there. It's unlikely that Jesus' skin tones were white in the traditional, as you get it in much of the traditional art, as you get it in Hollywood Jesuses. It's more likely had darker skin tones, and is much more likely to have looked something like this.
You have to understand the initial images of Christ in the Madonna, in countries like Poland, Spain, Italy, these are white Caucasian countries, worship a black Madonna and a black Jesus. These images were altered and changed.
I think you are suggesting that there's some pretty good historical anthropological evidence suggesting that Jesus just probably was black. Am I correctly stating your... That's right. Are you there, caller?
Yes, Phil. I just want to say that when God said he was going to make man in his image, he did not mean white, green, or any color. It was supposed to be spiritually like him.
Very good.
And that's what is important.
Yes, well...
No matter if Jesus is black, white, green, red, I believe in the supreme being, and I think that's what we all have to look at.
Right.
That there's a supreme being,
but what
and it
color
doesn't matter what
color has Jesus been throughout your childhood?
White, and
What
I
color-
think that's ridiculous.
What
because,
color was his mother?
You know, who knows? And I don't think anyone...
A notable biblical scholar who explained one origin of African presence in the Bible. Genesis 10:1 refers to the sons of Noah as Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who themselves had sons after the flood. Genesis 10:6 refers to the Hamites as the sons of Ham, who inhabited North and Northeast Africa. The sons are Cush, which is present-day Ethiopia, Mizraim, present-day Egypt, Put, present-day Libya, and Canaan, which is present-day Palestine, Israel. The African presence is still visible in Israel today. There are thousands of African Palestinians who live in Israel with deep roots to the land, whose ancestors date back for centuries. I met with Ali Jaddah, tour guide, and the informal mayor of the African Palestinians in Jerusalem. I asked him about his life and relations between the Afro-Arabs and the Jews.
As a black Palestinian, I am double oppressed by the Israel. First of all, they oppress me as a Palestinian. Secondly, they oppress me because of my color. Whenever I go around in the Israeli side, they call me Kushi. Kushi means nigger.
We have a little Canaanite boy, and he is with the donkey, and he's taking care of his sheep.
I am Canaanite in Israel.
And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange unto them, and spake roughly unto them. And Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew not him. But they knew not him. But they knew not him. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them, and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel their father, he said, How is it that ye are come so soon today? And they said, An Egyptian delivered us, an Egyptian delivered us.
They do not tell the truth. They're liars. They manipulate our history books. The history books are not true. It's a lie. The history books are lying. You need to know that. You must know that.
And the Lord said furthermore unto him, Put now thine hand into thy bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous as snow. And he said, Put thine hand into thy bosom again. And he put his hand into his bosom again, and plucked it out of his bosom, and behold, it was turned again as his other flesh. As his other flesh.
And as Paul was led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, May I speak unto thee? who said, Canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days madest an uproar, and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? Art not thou that Egyptian? Art not thou that Egyptian?
The sons of Japheth, Gomer and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tyrus. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah.
But the Bible also foretold that a day would come when God would gather his children back to the land of Israel. God is gathering his children home, and it is Christians bringing them. And it is Christians bringing them. That is our form of witness.
There has never been a more persecuted people, a more oppressed people. There has never been a more persecuted people, a more oppressed people.
And you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. And now the people of God around the world are responding to this mandate as never before. This global prayer initiative is established with the support and participation of nearly 1,000 of the world's most respected Christian leaders, united with one voice, calling the church to prayer for Jerusalem.
It's God's direction for us. We come to the conclusion that if Israel's blessed, ultimately the world's going to be blessed.
The most important thing we can do today is pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
We need international help. We also need supernatural help.
Over 400 of America's foremost evangelical leaders, together in one room with a single purpose: to speak and act with one voice in support of Israel, the largest pro-Israel organization in the United States, and one of the leading Christian grassroots movements in the world. That first meeting so inspired Christian leaders that just 5 months later, their influence encouraged over 4,000 Bible-believing Christians to converge on our nation's capital for the first Washington-Israel Summit. Christians from all 50 states came together at the Hilton Hotel in a passionate and unified display of support for Israel and the Jewish people. The timing was ordained of God. As Israel went to war in Lebanon, CUFI was boldly supporting them in Washington, and their support of Israel's right to the land by biblical mandate.
I can't resist to say it. I will be silent no more. Our times demand it, our history compels it, our future requires it, and most of all, God is watching.
All Christians who love Israel are invited to join. They can start by signing the Israel Pledge, which states, "We believe that the Jewish people have a right to live in their ancient land of Israel, and that the modern state of Israel is the fulfillment of this historic right."
Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee, till thou be destroyed, because thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded thee. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and shall pursue thee, and shall pursue thee. And they shall be upon thee for a sign and for a wonder, and upon thy seed forever. They shall be upon thee for a sign and for a wonder, and upon thy seed forever. Because thou servedst not the Lord thy God with joyfulness, and with gladness of heart, for the abundance of all things. Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee, in hunger, and in thirst, and in nakedness, and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck, until he have destroyed thee. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck, until he have destroyed thee. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor shew favor to the young. The Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. There ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. And thy heaven that is over thy head shall be brass, and the earth that is under thee shall be iron. Thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her.
Their toil helped make the United States the richest nation on earth.
Thou shalt build an house, and thou shalt not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and shalt not gather the grapes thereof. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. And thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. The fruit of thy land and all thy labors shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up, and thou shalt be only oppressed and crushed away, so that thou shalt be mad for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. So that thou shalt be mad for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And thy carcass shall be meat unto all fowls of the air, and unto the beasts of the earth, and no man shall fray them away. Thus saith the Lord my God, feed the flock of the slaughter, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty, and they that sell them say, Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. Whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty, and they that sell them say, Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. And shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were even! And at even thou shalt say, Would God it were morning! For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. The Lord shall smite thee with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart. And thou shalt grope at noonday, as the blind gropeth in darkness, and thou shalt not prosper in thy ways. And thou shalt not prosper in thy ways. And thou shalt be only oppressed and spoiled evermore, and no man shall save thee. And thou shalt be only oppressed and spoiled evermore, and no man shall save thee. And no man shall save thee. The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. Thy sons have fainted. They lie at the head of all the streets as a wild bull in a net. They are full of the fury of the Lord, the rebuke of thy God. But this is a people robbed and spoiled. They are all of them snared in holes, and they are hid in prison houses. They are for a prey, and none delivereth, for a spoil, and none saith, Restore. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Cush, and from Cush. And it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations, whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee, and shalt return unto the Lord thy God, and shalt obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, that then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity, and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations, whither the Lord thy God hath scattered thee.
A lot of black folks don't go for this black Jesus at all. They're praying to a white Jesus all their lives. This is their Jesus, and no activist of the moment is going to come along and rip that imagery out of their soul.
Who among you will give ear to this? Who will hearken and hear for the time to come? Who gave Jacob for a spoil and Israel to the robbers? Did not the Lord, he against whom we have sinned? For they would not walk in his ways, neither were they obedient unto his law. Therefore he hath poured upon him the fury of his anger, and the strength of battle, and it hath set him on fire round about. Yet he knew not, and it burned him. Yet he laid it not to heart. Yet he laid it not to heart. Yet he laid it not to heart.